Here today for this session of the Futures in Question CRASSH Research Network. My name is Erin Campbell, and I'll be moderating this panel on climate futures, which will explore different ways of calculating and imagining, the climate crisis as both this, impending apocalyptic threat, but also as this catastrophe, which has already begun in many ways, and also maybe as an opportunity or at least a catalyst for imagining more sustainable and more just ways of living. Our first speaker will be Sigourney, followed by Dr. Lisa Garforth, and finally Dr. Jakub Kowalewski. After hearing from our speakers, we'll take a quick break and then carry on with audience questions, which you can ask in person or submit to the Zoom chat if you're online. And one of my colleagues can read it for you. So to get started, I'd like to welcome Sigourney, a science communications specialist. She was most recently communications manager for Working Group 3 of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, where she led communications for two major reports, the IPCC Special Report on Climate Change and Land, and the Working Group 3 contribution to the 6th Assessment Report on Climate Mitigation. Before working at the IPCC, she held a number of communications roles working across science and engineering, focusing on high-performance computing, research data, and quantum optics. Please join me in welcoming Sigourney.
Thank you. So everyone can hear us online. I don't know the microphone.
I don't. This is the microphone. So
Oh,
at this.
That's amazing. Okay, excellent. I'm just going to get my presentation up. Okay, cool. I assume everyone can see that online. Do I need to share my screen or?
Yes.
Yeah. Show it back. Oh, so they can see it, or I need to share
No,
it?
you need to share it.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, that wasn't here at all. Yeah. You can see it online.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Cool. Thanks for inviting me to speak. I feel like a little bit of an imposter because I've actually just left the IPCC. So I'm going to talk about IPCC like I'm still there, but I'm not actually there anymore. So I'm going to sort of split this talk into two different sections. I'm going to cover a bit about what the IPCC is, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, not to be confused with the Independent Police Complaints Commission, as my emails remind me regularly. I'm just going to move that up there. And I'm going to talk a bit about the audiences that IPCC communicates with, as well as what Working Group 3 does. So I come from the Working Group 3 background, looking at climate mitigation, so things that we can do to keep our emissions lower. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the future, how we envision the future in IPCC and different ways that we do that. And we do that mostly through scenarios. So I'm going to talk about what IPCC scenarios are. And technically IPCC doesn't do scenarios, but I'll get into that. I'll talk a bit about the pathways that we use in this assessment cycle. And then I'm going to talk a bit about who uses those pathways, what they're useful for, and how we communicate those to a wider audience. So what is IPCC and what do we do? So we assess the science related to climate change. So we look at the science and provide an assessment of it. We don't do any actual science, so we assess literature basically. And we release reports that provide that assessment, and those need to be neutral with respect to policy. So we don't tell policymakers what to do. We simply give them the information so that they can make the decisions that they need to make. And that's a really sensitive act to balance when you're writing a report, but also when you're communicating a report. So we're split into 3 working groups. This is a nice little illustration that my colleague did. She discovered drawing when we were in the middle of IPCC because she was probably just really stressed out. That takes over your whole life. But she discovered this hobby. Anyway, she's got this great illustration of all the different working groups. So Working Group 1 looks at the physical science basis, so the actual climate system. Working Group 2 looks at the impacts from climate change and how we can adapt to those impacts and what our vulnerabilities are. And Working Group 3, where I'm from, how we can limit emissions of greenhouse gases in order to bring the global temperature down and also to limit those impacts. So there's been 3 reports so far that came out over the past 2 years. And there's a synthesis report coming out, I think in March. It's being delayed a bit because of COVID. But yeah, that will basically do what it says on the tin, synthesize all 3 reports for policymakers. In IPCC, we have kind of a big communications challenge because our main audience is policymakers. That is the remit of IPCC. It's to communicate the science to policymakers so they can do what they have to do. Unfortunately, the world is very different now from when IPCC was set up 30 plus years ago. I think it was established in 1988. And the world that we live in today is very different. People are much more aware of climate change. They're more interested in the science related to climate change, and they're more knowledgeable about it as well. So although policymakers is still technically our remit, in reality, it doesn't quite work like that. So we do technically have to speak to the general public. We have to speak with the press and the media, and we rely on the press and media quite a lot to translate those scientific messages to a lay audience, to the general public. We speak with businesses and NGOs as well, because climate science is important for their own internal policies, especially as governmental policies change and mean that they have to do things differently. And we speak with educators, scientists, people like yourselves as well. So very, very wide reach, but very specific remit. And we had limited resources in this assessment cycle. I was the first communications person in working group 3 ever. So there was never someone trying to communicate what climate mitigation is to the world from IPCC before me. Well, actually, I had a colleague that was in the role before me for a year. But yeah, but before this assessment cycle, there was no one doing it, which is crazy to think about in hindsight. And it's really complex stuff. And I think you'll get this when I go through what I'm going to go through, which is very science heavy. So I hope you're in for some science. I'm glad I'm the first speaker because I think that will help. So this is the Working Group 3 mitigation report that came out in April last year. It's a pretty wide-ranging report. So just bear this in mind when I give my presentation. It covers a lot. It covers a huge amount of options, mitigation options across the different sectors. So it looks at what you can do in transport to limit emissions, what you can do through in buildings, what you can do in industry, in plastics, and metals. It's really, really, it's a big report. It's going to be, once published, probably over 1,000 pages long in paper. So it also covers stuff like international cooperation. What are the institutions, what are the policies that could be put in place to see global warming be reduced? What kind of money do we need? What is the gap? So it's really, really wide ranging, basically. But I'm going to focus on these 2 chapters, which are arguably the 2 most complex chapters of the report, because they look at the scenario side of assessing climate change. So I'll give you an introduction to what scenarios are in a second. But basically, these chapters are threaded throughout the rest of the report as well. So they look at how we talk about this. They kind of provide projections for the future, and those are intertwined within the other chapters of the report. So for example, what will the future of transport look like? What will the future of technology and technology development look like, etc. But yeah, into scenarios. So what is IPCC's perspective, or what do we do? First, to explain this, I have to sort of describe what scenarios are, and maybe just a show of hands in the room. Do you know what climate mitigation scenarios are? Yeah, some people kind of know. Okay, that's good enough. So basically, IPCC assesses the scenarios. We don't actually do them. There's a lot of overlap in terms of who prepares climate mitigation scenarios and who assesses them in IPCC. So those communities are quite similar, but yeah, we don't do them. Basically, scenarios are a way of sort of picturing the future or imagining the future, and they don't predict the future. You have to be very careful, especially in IPCC, to identify what is a prediction versus what is an idea of the future or projection, what could happen. We're not predicting the future. We're simply saying these are possibilities of what the future could look like, depending on if we do A, B, C, D, etc. And in order to develop these scenarios, scientists use data and information, and they input it to have this idea of what the future is going to look like. So they could be using stuff like population information, how fast they think the population is going to grow, technology change, where they think that's going to go. I mean, everything down to behavior and social and cultural change. These are things that are input into models to identify what the future could look like. So in IPCC, we use scenarios for different things. In working group 1, they use scenarios to figure out how warm the world might get or how warm we already are. In working group 2, they use those to figure out what impacts are going to look like in the future. For example, how high is the sea going to rise and when? And in working group 3, we use them to figure out what we could do to limit emissions in order to reduce those things, in order to reduce their impacts, and in order to limit global warming. So who actually uses these scenarios or these pathways, and I'll explain. Policymakers, first and foremost, employ them in order to develop policies at an international and a national scale. So stuff like the Paris Agreement, these are key inputs into high-level policy making at that level, but also more locally, but more at a national level. So countries' greenhouse gas and carbon dioxide net zero goals, when are they going to reach those goals? What are those goals going to be, whether that's for reducing emissions or rollout of technology, for example. So this is why scenarios are important, because they help policymakers to identify the world that we want to be in, and then some of the goals and markers around that world. But also people are interested in climate mitigation scenarios despite not knowing what they are, because they give you information about where we're going. So you can use that information to talk about climate change and to lobby your leaders and to affect change in the real world. So multiple audiences. Okay, so this is where we get into the science. So I'm going to show you a couple of graphs and break them down. And this is what IPCC does, basically. It presents the science. And communicating this stuff to all different types of audiences is really, really tricky. But the best way to do it is to explain it, I think, in detail and to go through it step by step. So that's what I'm going to try to do. I'm going to break it down into small pieces, and then I'm going to show how the science that we produced turned into bigger messages for the media and the general public, big audiences. Okay, so this is a figure from the SPM, the Summary for Policymakers, which is like a shorter document that does what it says. It summarizes their whole report, and it's for policymakers. And basically, I wouldn't pay too much attention to the title of the graph, although I should probably explain it. What I'm more interested in demonstrating is these lines and what these different futures are and what they mean in terms of levels of emissions. So on the left there, the title says projected global greenhouse gas emissions from NDCs. Right? NDCs are basically pledges. They're called nationally determined. So how are emissions going to turn out from what we've pledged that we will do as countries? And these are all based on pledges that were done before COP26. So IPCC has a cutoff, and so we have to stop assessing science after a certain period of time. Otherwise, we would just be going on forever and ever and ever. So this is our cutoff, was just before COP26, but everything after COP26 will be in the next report. And how likely is it that we're going to exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius? And how likely is it that we can limit warming to below 2 degrees Celsius? So again, focus on the graph if you can. Okay, so the red line at the top, I don't know if I can point for the online audience. I suppose you can kind of figure it out yourself. The red line at the top looks at where we are in terms of the policies that have already been implemented. So this is how many emissions we would be releasing up to 2050 if we just followed on the trajectory that was already happening, right? So it would be pretty high. Emissions wouldn't really go anywhere. Emissions reduction, sorry, wouldn't really go anywhere. The purple line is what it would look like if we limited warming to 2 degrees Celsius. And the green line is also what would happen if we limited warming to 2 degrees Celsius. So there's two different scenarios here. One is we act today, so literally today, within the next couple of years, or one is if we don't act today, if we hold out, right? So you see there's that line that kind of doesn't do anything. So this one sort of drops off immediately, this one waits and then it drops off. Basically, the longer it takes to act, the more you have to do and the more quickly. And that's what that drop off means. That purple line also shows what emissions would look like if we overshot 1.5 degrees Celsius. And 1.5 is a safe level of global warming. And if we overshot that and then came back down to below 1.5 degrees Celsius, and that's high overshoot. So that could be 1.6, 1.7 degrees Celsius. then coming back down. And you can decide if that's really a 1.5 pathway for yourself or not. That kind of is my opinion, doesn't it? So and then a true 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway is the one in blue. What would emissions look like if we were to aim for 1.5 degrees Celsius? So there's a big gap. There's your gap, right? And where we are and where we need to be if we want to limit warming that much. These bits basically give you the snapshots of what that will look like in 2050 and 2100. And what's interesting is in this purple one, you get to net negative emissions. So you go below net zero emissions. This means you're taking more carbon out of the atmosphere than you're putting into it, essentially in crude terms. So you actually have to have net negative emissions in 2100 in order to do that. So yeah, so that's how we visualize where emissions are going to go. But what does this actually mean? Well, the graph that I showed you, I explained this a little bit. You need drastic emissions reductions to keep global warming below 1 or 2 degrees Celsius. Delaying action means more work later on, and that's that purple steep curve. And the decisions prior to COP26 don't put us on one of those optimal paths. So, not good. I will say, we don't have the today information, so we don't have the COP27 update in this report. I think it's still safe to say that that doesn't put us on one of those optimal paths, though. So I didn't say that as IPCC, by the way. Okay. In this assessment cycle, what was really interesting is we kind of went a step beyond just providing these sort of like greenhouse gas emissions projections and what level of temperature you would be at. And we looked at, if we want to go into the future, what are the different options that line up with those levels of warming, right? So it's all well and good to say, oh, well, we need to aim for 2 degrees Celsius, but what is it that's actually going to get us there? Yeah, because that's the stuff that policymakers are really interested in. And to demonstrate that, I'm just going to show you this. I'm going to break down this graph as well. Okay, so we're looking at net zero greenhouse gas emissions overall, but this graph ultimately plots the same as the last graph. On the left, you've got the levels of CO2 equivalent, and on the bottom, you've got your years, right? If we continue on the path that we were running, we've got that red line at the top. If we had some kind of moderate action, it would be significantly below that. What gets interesting is when we look at pathways for 2 degrees Celsius and what happens in those pathways. So this is the same line you saw on the other graph. You can see that we reached net zero emissions, greenhouse gas emissions in 2100, right? So that's kind of like a milestone to focus on, to look towards. On the left here is kind of small for people online, but you can see in the room, there's something called IMPGS, and that stands for Illustrative Mitigation Pathways, Gradual Strengthening. So in this assessment cycle, IPCC Working Group 3 came up with these illustrative mitigation pathways. And ultimately, those are pathways that illustrate places we could get to. And gradual strengthening means we gradually strengthen our policies in order to reach 2 degrees Celsius. And this is the sort of projection of how emissions would drop over time, or levels of emissions would drop over time. So you can see in 2060 where we would be, 2080 where we would be, basically goals that we can hit. Similarly for the negative emissions mitigation pathway. So IMPNEG stands for Illustrative Mitigation Pathway with Negative Emissions. So that's pulling greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, pulling carbon out of the atmosphere using carbon dioxide removal techniques or other techniques. And there are a few others as well. And these are all the 1.5 degree compatible ones, these C1 pathways. So you've got one that says LD, that's with low demand, i.e. reducing our demand for energy, for fossil fuel energy, reducing our demand on products and services as well, because we can do a lot through behavior change, for example. IMP-REN is focusing on renewable energies. If we had a future where we focus more on bringing in renewable energies and less on other things, what would that look like? And then the final one there is shifting development pathways. Sorry, it says SP, not SDP, but it's shifting development pathways. And each one of these future potential pathways lines up with a date down here of when you would reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions. That's important, but what's even more important for the way we communicate this to the public is when we reach net zero CO2 emissions, and those are different things. Reaching net zero greenhouse gases and net zero CO2 are very different, because CO2 is obviously just one type of greenhouse gas. What this report demonstrates is that when you reach net zero CO2 emissions, the temperature stabilizes. So if you want to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius, you need to know when net zero is going to happen. And that's when you will reach that point. So for example, if you want 1.5 degrees Celsius, that happens around 2050. And this is why we have so many policies aiming to reach net zero CO2 around 2050. So this is basically what IPCC provides, a whole bunch of mitigation scenarios that help policymakers to make the decisions that they need to make. But how do we present that to the real world? And this is where IPCC has a big challenge, because it's not really what we do. We rely on other people to do it for us. And I think that should change personally, because we have so much inbuilt knowledge, scientific knowledge within our community. It's just about the resources and what it is acceptable for IPCC to do or to not do. Because one of the things that IPCC is very good at is coming to agreements, and that happens in negotiation sessions. So we have the summary for policymakers that we approve line by line. And somehow, after many, many, many hours of negotiation, we always get there. And that's because we're very neutral with respect to what we do. As soon as you engage in dialogues with the general public, it becomes a bit more murky. So that's just one thing to bear in mind in terms of what IPCC's remit is now and what maybe it could be in the future. So these are the main messages that came out of the Working Group 3 report. I think it is really important just to note that there are options available now in all sectors that can at least halve our emissions by 2030, i.e. we have the things to do a lot right now. And I haven't highlighted that in this presentation because that's not really what I was going to describe. I'm talking about the mitigation pathways. But it's important to remember for the publicity that the report receives as well. But this is the message, one of the main messages that I sort of covered in those graphs. In terms of what that means to the public and the sort of key messages that we released to the public about getting to 1.5, you could see these in these graphs, right? We need emissions to peak before 2025, and all the 1.5 lines did that. They all peak for 2025. But we have to translate that because people don't like reading graphs necessarily, especially IPCC ones, which are like beyond comprehension. And then they have to be reduced by 43% by 2030. Then further emissions reductions in the following decades, and of course, reaching net zero carbon dioxide by 2050. So those were the big messages that we released in our press release. And in the other comments that we released when the report was launched. But how did the media reflect that? Well, they're not actually wrong. It kind of is now or never. It's just not to stave off climate disaster. If we want to limit warming to 1.5, now or never is before 2025, acting by 2025. And that's now, if you ask me. So yeah, if we want to stave off, going over 1.5, we have to act now. Emissions need to peak by 2025. We did say that. And the report is a call for action. Everyone is, isn't it? And then finally, we do offer solutions to limit global warming. So this is just like a very, very small snapshot, mostly from English-speaking media about what the report says. What's really interesting is how the report is covered in different parts of the world and what they highlight as important. That's something I think there's some research going on at Oxford about, at the Reuters Institute, which I'm excited to see the results on. But yeah, so you can see how typically the news covers it in that sort of disastrous, scary way, when in actuality, we really tried to focus on the solutions. I presented here some of the most dark side, but we really did try and focus on the solutions and what we could get done. I'm going to leave it there because I think I've talked long enough, but these are some things you might want to have a look at. If you're interested in sci-fi writing about the IPCC pathways and just IPCC stuff in general, those two authors at the top have both done some work on that. If you want to delve into the report a bit more, but you don't want to read the whole report, which I haven't done, so I wouldn't blame you not doing that. There's a really good explainer on YouTube. And then if you're interested in the scenarios, which I very crudely explained here, definitely have a look at the Carbon Brief article. They did a really great breakdown of what they mean, each scenario, and they go into more detail about what does a low demand scenario look like? What does, increasing renewables actually look like for the future? And then there's an event that we ran at COP, but I'll leave those here. I hope I didn't overwhelm you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. Next, we have Dr. Lisa Garforth, who lectures in sociology at Newcastle University. Her research explores how fiction can help us imagine. If you want to pull up your.
Yes, okay.
Absolutely. Can help us imagine more sustainable societies and ways of life. Her 2017 monograph, Green Utopias, traces a range of expressions of environmental hope in policy discourse, ecological politics, and speculative fiction since the 1960s. Her recent work focuses on how the climate crisis and Anthropocene debates are reshaping environmental imaginaries and how reading speculative fiction can be a mode of public engagement with climate and sustainability futures. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Garforth.
I've had to follow that. Thank you very much for a fantastic place to kick us off. Except that to say that I will also be recommending Kim Stanley Robinson, so myself thread of continuity there. So I've been working on trying to understand how in social theory and policy and any kind of philosophy and politics we can imagine alternatives to business as usual. Industrial capitalism, essentially global industrial capitalism, and what options that gives us culturally, really, primarily in fiction and social theory, and kind of shared political imaginaries, how we can think through better kinds of futures. And I started this work really thinking from the point of view, broadly speaking, of contemporary utopian studies. And I thought I ought to perhaps try and, partly because I'm starting at such a different place from the previous talk, so what I mean by that, to just give you some context for it. Thinking about utopia then, not as blueprints for authoritarian futures, but as essentially just vivid, detailed pictures of alternative socio-political structures and ways of life, based on ideas and ideals, not on data and prediction and projection, although having to work with those, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. Often criticised and associated with escapism, fantasy, lack of realism, or at the other end with authoritarianism and excessive radicalism. But for me, utopia is a fundamentally social force. And by that, I mean it's something that happens in our socialized selves and in our social relationships as a result of living in societies and having to anticipate with others what kind of future we're making and how it might be different. So I see utopia as importantly fictional, but a kind of fiction that's rooted in everyday collective social life. And here follow, as many people in contemporary utopian studies do, work of philosopher Ernst Bloch, who locates utopian dynamics across a really wide range of discourses, texts, ways of thinking, and ways of imagining. So I see utopia very much as a kind of critical and creative resource, and after Ruth Levitas's work, it's a response to loss and lack, what we don't have in the present, and how we fill that gap with imaginations of how things might be different. And increasingly, I feel like I lean on this part of it, especially when I'm teaching utopia, which is an odd position to take as a sociologist. We generally don't get involved in existential debates. We don't get too philosophical. But to argue essentially that, if you want to argue that utopia is impractical and impossible and daydreamy and awful, I imagine a world without it and how impoverished and problematic that will be. So I think that ends up being a kind of existential argument for it. So I've been doing this work for quite a long time, trying to think about green utopia, make the argument that if a truly sustainable society, particularly in our world, in the West and the North, doesn't exist, then we need to imagine it, whether that's in parts or as a whole, whether we think about the endpoint we want to get to or the steps we want to take towards it. And this phrase, expressions of desire for a better way of living and being, I should put it in quotes really, is Ruth Levitas's. But for me, I'm specifically interested in what that better way of living and being might look like if we treat the non-human world as a part of that. And I've tried to make the argument that there's flashes of that kind of utopia, that vision of a more ecologically sustainable, a more environmentally and socially just world across a surprising range of discourses since the I'd start with the limits to growth in the 1960s and some of those, the emergence of a very particular kind of Western eco-philosophical work in that period. So I see it in policy, I see it in radical politics, and importantly in speculative fiction, and I'll come into why I think fiction is so important in a minute. But latterly, of course, I've been trying to think through how the contemporary conditions for imagining that brighter utopian green future have been really constrained and reshaped by climate crisis and climate injustice. I don't think we can talk about that in terms of predictions of the future now. I think we need to think about how that crashes into our and implodes into our present and into our everyday. And that really changes the kind of basis on which utopian expressions around environmental futures can work. So I started the kind of work I've done really by retrospectively looking at some of these kinds of visions, right? So the Club of Rome's Limits to Growth from 1971, Small is Beautiful, kind of visions of the blue, whole blue planet, and more radical articulations of that as well. In deep ecology and feminist ecology in particular. So that work seems to me to be intrinsically utopian in all sorts of interesting ways. But I also think that the policy articulations of sustainability and sustainable development that followed on from that more radical turn in the 60s and 70s, although many in utopian studies, because they're not hugely radical, recognise them as kind of revolutionary utopian politics, have this vision of a saner, more sustainable world very much running through them in complicated ways. But that part of this work that I've been doing for a long time, for me, comes in science fiction and speculative fiction. Particularly, it is very Western, and I work a lot with Kim Stanley Robinson's work. So at the moment, I'm kind of trying to wrangle with, the fact that I keep going back to this very privileged Western male writer, and I need to give that some thought. But these are some of the novels that have been most inspirational to me in trying to think about what it is that speculative fiction can do particularly well to persuade us that a way of life that's fundamentally different from our own can be fundamentally satisfying, right? Some of you will know some of these novels, maybe. This is one of Robinson's really early ecological utopian fictions, part of the trilogy. Pierce's Woman on the Edge of Time is the one that people tend to know still, which is really interesting. It's a really old piece of eco-feminist fiction, and this is the best one that Le Guin's always coming up. If you want a recommendation, it is also massive. The kind of anthropological imaginary of a California after industrial capitalism and white colonialism. Interesting thought experiment, and a fantastic piece of writing. So these are visions, all of them, of low or no growth economies, a kind of set of discourses around no growth and degrowth that are now coming back with a vengeance, I think, into political and policy discourse. They're about a post-capitalist society or a radically curtailed capitalism in the case of Kim Stanley Robinson's writing. They're very much about letting go of the possibility of global mobility, and that has its interests and its problems. But they're very much about re-understanding how to live in place, whether that's through a kind of conservative bioregionalism in some of those threads, or a more politically radical, I'm thinking of Marie Buckchin's work here, kind of decentralized eco-anarchism, and to imagine and set out in fiction cultures of sufficiency and connection rather than cultures of habit. So my take on this, not as a literary critic or a literature specialist, but as a sociologist, is that these are novels that not only set out a kind of structural vision of what a sustainable society might look like, and I can tell you very clearly that in my discipline of sociology, no one else is doing that really with any great vividness or power, and when they are, their kind of visions of the future are pretty unsatisfying and thin, because novels do this in a really powerful way, right? They invite us to empathise with certain kinds of characters, they invite us to imagine ourselves living in these worlds. I mean, that's what really good speculative fiction does, I think. So for me as a sort of social theorist, fiction is really important, not in a subjugate way to social theorising and philosophy, but it's kind of 3 steps ahead quite often, I think, in terms of how we think about a sociology of a non-existent society that we might want to bring into being. So this is why, I've already said this really, why speculative fiction, I think, is so important. Now, it's important, I think, also to just briefly mention that the novels I've talked about are not, they're not the kind of classic utopias of the turn of the 19th, 20th century. They are critical, they are thoughtful, they are reflexive about utopia itself, as well as offering a kind of alternative vision. And I think these novels really matter as part of a wider social conversation about better, greener futures, not because they set out goals, but because they stimulate hopeful and creative thinking. The problem now is that the future that those novels projected their worlds into is not the open space that I think perhaps it was in the 1970s and perhaps until the mid-80s, I think. The way that future now feels, again, you can see I've just used a really generic. I'm not going to break that down in detail. I think what I'm trying to get at with this set of images is to kind kind of indicate something about what comes to mind when we think about the closeness of what the future might be like in the face of climate, right? We know already we've got a kind of overdeveloped, over-exhausted planet. We know already that nature isn't this beautiful separate thing from us, it's entangled with. And I'm going to stop there because I'm not getting into kind of post-natural social theorizing. I don't want to do that. We know already that the crises that were being predicted in the 1970s probably already were there if we could have seen them through kind of the lenses of environmental justice. They were in places that perhaps relatively privileged white philosophers weren't seeing. So that the future is a space for projecting a beautiful alternative green world is not really viable anymore, I don't think. And the discourses that shape the very future itself have shifted so much since that early work that I did, demands a really significant rethinking. I mean, there's lots of ways in which, particularly literary theorists, have thought about the ways in which, for example, the report, The Limits to Growth, used the projection of a 100-year future, of a 100-year catastrophic future if business as usual continued, as an argument for saying, well, look ahead and see what else could happen at the end of that 100 years. I mean, that 100-year future is not really a meaningful way of framing climate future thinking there, right? We know that apocalyptic kind of unfolding of environmental and climate catastrophe is already inside our societies. It's not out there, it's not in the future, it's in here, it's in our present time. And that notion of slow violence that Rob Nixon used really powerfully in 2012, that I think anticipated by someone like Bjorn was writing, Frederick Bjorn was writing about this in 2005 was really important. And I think however important and vital those projections are from the IPCC, I find it really interesting that they have essentially kind of colonized the shape of the future, and they make it hard to think around in the open ways that utopianism needs. And that's not criticism, it's an empirical fact that utopianism has to now find its way around that. This is why Kowalewski Robbins is such an important utopian writer. The idea of a nature separate from humans is problematized. The kind of vision of going back to nature that was in a lot of those early novels is not a viable one anymore, I don't think. And the idea of a whole earth where we are all facing an ecological catastrophe has clearly been absolutely exploded by the emergence of important voices that have tried to reintroduce the huge problem of environmental injustice, environmental colonialism, environmental racism into these debates, and that wasn't there, I think, in those earlier articulations. I probably don't need to say very much about the extent to which, in the face of that huge shift, the space of that kind of cultural projection of the climate future has been utterly colonized by themes of apocalypse, dystopia, extinction. And I don't also want to say that these cannot also be spaces where there is room for utopia and hope. It's utterly simplistic to imagine that apocalyptic ideas in apocalyptic fictional imaginaries do not also carry the charge of the possibility of revitalization, that those radical voices that, you know, as in Extinction Rebellion, that pose the future as a literal stark, life or death struggle, are entirely negative. There's really good writing about this now, especially empirical work on Extinction Rebellion that makes that case really clearly. But it also means that utopia in this context of perceived doom, anxiety, dystopia, and apocalypse is, as Kowalewski Robinson says, even more important. And this bit involved here, I think, is a fascinating thought that he's been trying to persuade us of for a long time. But utopia essentially has now gone from being a kind of minor literary genre to an existential necessity. Because if we are going to navigate the kinds of projections that the IPCC are giving us, we are going to have to do that with more than despair and anxiety and horror. It's going to have to come with, you know, recharged hope and creative possibility. At the same time, Robinson repeats endlessly that the bar for utopia has to fall. You know, that the idea that utopia can only be about a good life, a better life, human well-being, and changed socioeconomic circumstances. It might end up having to be more about dodging a mass extinction. So I suppose I just wanted to try and end on a slightly more positive note, and the way that, for me, the notion of the Anthropocene, which many of you will be familiar with, I think, has interestingly reopened the space in which we can think about utopia and climate, because it's so much about undoing. if we think about what the Anthropocene is supposed to be, this era in which human activities have dominant influence on climate and environment, and more importantly, I think the kind of cultural and political reckoning with it, and I know that includes problematizing the very notion of the Anthropocene. I think that horse has bolted, and we're kind of stuck with that term now, for better or for worse. You may disagree, and I'm happy to hear that. But I think that this idea of the Anthropocene has come along at a moment that forces open a kind of different understanding of what utopia might do around climate and environmental crisis, a refusal of projecting things into the future, a massive disruption of linear temporalities, which are part of what's got into this mess in the first place. You know, if we are living in a fundamentally new era, then the idea of kind of linearity of the modern fantasy of control and progress is deeply problematized. This idea that humans are the major geological impact on the planet undermines these kind of deeply rooted nature and culture dichotomies. And interestingly, for science fiction, if you're interested in how this plays, the idea of the Anthropocene that's kind of refusing the idea that small individual humans are the basic unit of agency and meaning, and kind of explodes that outwards, makes the Anthropocene, for many theorists and science fiction studies, a science fictional thing. And I find this idea really exciting and really, especially for sociology, which is work I'm doing at the moment, really exciting. But the Anthropocene is a kind of science fictional narrative. It's forcing us to rethink the very planet that we inhabit and see it as something alien, something that we've made in really deeply problematic ways. Ursula Heiser calls this a kind of uses a lot of science fiction writing, uses the trope of terraforming planets now as a way of inviting us to see our Earth as one that we've badly terraformed. And that kind of global perspective, I've been writing a bit about this in the context of some of Robinson's work in the last 20 years recently. But it's much bigger than Robinson, as Jerry Canavan says, looking at what speculative fiction is doing now in relation to futures and climate. A whole range of fictional texts now that are trying to stage metaphorical or allegorical confrontations with natures and futures that can never go back to normal. That the kind of utopias we're going to need now are going to be very strange, very uncanny, very unsettled, very unsettling. I've written quite a lot about this in relation to Genesis' work in our new series, Not in the Broken Earth trilogy, if you know that work, and The City We Became, which is a kind of take on a kind of racial critique of the weird, and in relation to something like a novel like Annihilation, which unwinds nature and humans in really complicated ways. And I think if anyone's seen the recent adaptation of Gibson's The Peripheral, which was interesting, but it did really bring the climate stuff into the foreground in a way that, you know, he leaves it quite stuck in the novel in quite interesting ways. These are not novels then that imagine beautiful green futures, but they are novels that maintain a kind of utopian hope in complicated ways through dystopia, through apocalypse often. And this comes, just to quickly finish up then, in a range of ways that literature, I think, helps us as social thinkers and political thinkers. Gives us some of the tools we might want to do some work on rethinking what it means to imagine different kinds of climate futures. This is a big point that I've kind of reduced to a little one, but Adam Trexler's work on Anthropocene fiction is really interesting on how new speculative fiction blurs the boundaries between realism and speculation and refuses the idea that there's a clear distinction between those things. If you look at contemporary climate speculative fiction, it's very clear that genres are mixed up, you know, within text rather than across one. So one of the things I've been thinking about quite a lot recently is now in Kim Stanley Robinson's first environmental future trilogy. Each novel was a different genre. So there's a kind of post-apocalyptic novel, and there's a utopian novel and a dystopian novel. And now, if you read something like New York 2140, they're all smashing together in a big mess, but it's an exciting mess. And there is a lot of hope in there as well. Utopia needs to reside in the uncanny and the unholy often, and that's an interesting set of predictions for utopia, I think. But we need these fictional imaginaries, not because they're maps to where we need to be, but because they continue to refuse the closure around business as usual. Oh, excuse me. As usual, and maintain spaces of hope that there might be other worlds and better societies. I won't finish there, but that's kind of that.
very much. That was, again, absolutely fantastic. Next up, we have Dr. Jakub Kowalewski. If you'd like to pull up your PowerPoint. He's a researcher at Birkbeck University of London and St. Mary's University. He is the editor of Environmental Apocalypse, Interdisciplinary Reflections on the Climate Crisis, and is writing a book on the philosophy of climate apocalypticism. Jakub also has an interest in institutional approaches to sustainability and is currently completing a report on ecological behavior change in the Catholic Church. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kowalewski.
Thank you so much. Thanks for coming. Thank you for the invitation. Thanks for great talks as well. So I feel like there was first talk was about kind of the future. Then Lisa mentioned how the future and the present are coinciding, and I'll talk about how the past is brought into all this discussion as well. I'm going to talk about it in the context of apocalypse because that's what I research. And here's a book I've edited. 2 reasons why I bring this up. 1, absolutely shameless self-promotion. 2, my background is in philosophy, so I've been always told to give these really convincing arguments. I can't do it in 20 minutes. So if you want to find the convincing arguments, I promise you'll find them in my chapter there. I'm just going to try to summarize what I wanted to say in this particular thing regarding the notion of time, and specifically a problematization of imagining the future in the context of the climate crisis. So one of the things that people working in environmental humanities have pointed out is that there is something theological going on about how we think about the Anthropocene, how we think about climate change and climate crisis. And this is basically related to the notion of eschatology, which is just a notion in theology related to the last things. And more specifically, the way we think about climate crisis, these thinkers claim, basically mirrors the idea of history that we find in the Judeo-Christian tradition. So those of you who are familiar with it, you probably know that it's a sort of like a line that starts with creation, goes through revelation, that is to say, happening now, and then ends with some sort of redemption at the end, right? So the idea is that the way we think about climate crisis mirrors that linear structure with a very clear beginning, middle, and end. And specifically, the end here is important because very often the narratives which talk about, whether utopia or apocalypse, have this final event that sort of fulfills everything that's been going on, right? So whether you start, I don't know, in the 90s, or you start with Industrial Revolution, wherever you want to put the kind of the beginning of the climate crisis, there is a beginning, then there is an unraveling, and then there is a future that is going to culminate in this end, which basically mirrors the theological point of view and a theological view of history. Now, this is problematic because it very badly hides a Western-centric position. So if we are focusing on this future climate catastrophe, or even on the present climate catastrophe, what we're doing inadvertently is we're paying less attention, or even not accounting for all the possible climate catastrophes that took place in the past, and very often took place in the past as a result of colonialism. So I call it the decolonial critique of eschatology, but it's sort of a mouthful. Basically, I think there are 2 problems which I think are very, very pertinent to how we think about climate change, and specifically how we think about climate change in the context of this sort of eschatological framing. So the first problem, the exclusive focus on the environmental disaster as a feature of present end of linear history blinds us to the ends of history experienced by colonized communities in the past. There's been a lot of work done in this sort of stuff. I can talk about it later. But secondly, this idea of a single timeline leading towards this common catastrophe creates sort of fake sense of universalism. So we all in it together. We all have to defend ourselves against this sort of future climate catastrophe. But actually, this hides how climate crises are differentiated, and how this differentiation of climate crisis, namely who is actually more vulnerable than other people, basically is an effect of colonialism as well as imperialism, right? So we have this sort of problem here that if we're focusing too much on the future, we're missing what happened in the past. And if we're thinking about a single line or single historical line, we're missing out the differentiation and actually the unequal distribution of the climate crisis. So I'm going to say, so basically these thinkers that I just mentioned, like Garforth, for example, say that because of this, the colonial critique, we should abandon eschatology altogether. There is no value in it, and we should conceptualize the Anthropocene or the climate crisis in a different way. Now, I feel like that's absolutely fine if you want to do it, but I've got some sort of weird attachment to eschatology and apocalypse, and I wanted to defend it. And I think I can defend it. In fact, I think that there is a way of rereading the apocalyptic tradition in such a way that we can address both of these problems. So that's what I'm trying to do. So I'll talk more in depth about the first problem, how I can answer it, I hope. And I'll kind of point towards possible solutions to the second problem as well. I can talk about them in Q&A in more detail, but for the interest of time, we don't want to dwell too much on them. Okay, so, all right, so just to say, so to answer the first problem, namely this idea of sort of ignoring past climate crises or past climate catastrophes, I think that actually the apocalyptic tradition doesn't believe in a time as a single line going towards an end, but rather believes in time as in the shape of a spiral that brings together past, future, and the present. And it's through the spiral movement that I think we can answer the first problem. I also think that there is a way in which we can read apocalypticism as committed to multiple temporalities, not just one, and that would answer the second problem. But again, that's something I can talk about later. All right, so to answer the first problem, this exclusive focus on the future catastrophe or even on the present catastrophe at the expense of past catastrophes, I'm turning to two apocalyptic thinkers. So one is a 12th century Italian monk called Joachim of Fiore. And the other one is a German-Jewish philosopher of the 20th century, Jakub. And they both articulate, I think, the same intuition about how we should picture or visualize what time is or what history is. So this is a 12th century version of the IPCC, I guess, diagram. That's what they did. So this is Joachim of Fiore. He's famous for his illustrations. Check them out, they're really cool. Online, there's some dragons and stuff. It's pretty cool. Anyway, but here what we have is Joachim's very famous diagram of history. So I think the most famous thing that Joachim kind of contributes is a division of history into three stages. So stage number one, here, the first circle, is the stage of the father. And that's basically the events described by the Old Testament, where it's the Jewish people that play the central role, and it's the Jewish religion that plays the central role. That becomes superseded by the era of the Son, which basically is the era of Christianity and the era of the church specifically, and the church hierarchy. And then we've got this, we are on the cusp, 12th century, on the cusp of the era of the Holy Spirit, that is supposed to be coming in. And what's interesting about the era of the Holy Spirit is that the church no longer, the authority of the church is no longer necessary. We kind of internalize religious law, and we all live in monastic communities in a sort of egalitarian utopia, I guess. Now, on a side note, what's super fascinating is that the division of history into three is everywhere. I mean, you can find it in Marx with feudalism, capitalism, and communism. You can find it in Auguste Comte with his theological, metaphysical, and positive view of history. You can even find it in how we talk about history generally as ancient, medieval, and modern. It's all, I think, Joachim, by the way. But with the last one, if we think we are moderns, actually, that means that we're in the era of the Holy Spirit already. Let's just say. Anyway, so that's a side note. I've become obsessed with this. I can see the three everywhere, which is not helpful. But the important thing is, not only is it the case that we got these divisions, but what we can do, and this is fairly uncontroversial for medieval thinkers, is we can find parallels between the different eras. So, you know, it's quite a big thing in medieval sort of biblical scholarship to find parallels or concordances between different events and characters from the Old Testament and from the New Testament, right? So, for example, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob somehow mirror Zacharias, John the Baptist, and Christ. So what that means is basically that when we read the Old Testament and New Testament side by side, according to Christian thinkers, what we get is we get sort of parallels between different characters. Actually, not only according to Christian thinkers, because Calvert does a very similar thing as well. But anyway, so the important thing though is that history is actually not just a movement from creation up until the era of the Holy Spirit, and then to kind of the fulfillment of history, but it's also a repetition throughout this of particular meanings, events, and characters that happen. Now, on top of that, the reason why Joachim of Fiore is even talking about the era of the Holy Spirit in the first place is because he sees the relationship between the Old Testament and New Testament parallels as pointing towards future developments, right? So there's something that happens when he reads these two bits side by side in such a way that actually allow us to posit something into the future. So to kind of bring all these things together, we can clearly see that apocalypticism, in Joachim of Fiore version at least, is not committed to a linear timeline. On the contrary, what we get is we get a progressive movement of history, that's true, but this progressive movement of history goes through these parallels and this sort of concordances between the present situation, the past situation, and that allows us to then anticipate the future situation. So actually, we are constantly involved in this sort of spiral way of going back and forth between the present, the past, and the future on the basis of understanding this sort of parallels. Now, very interesting thing happens in Taubes, which is basically the same structure but applied to intellectual history. I guess that's what we kind of call it that way. So he wrote this book called Occidental Eschatology, and he provides this sort of linear narrative of the development of the apocalyptic theme throughout history. So it starts with ancient apocalypticism, goes through medieval one, and early modern, and then ends with sort of Hegel and Kierkegaard and Marx as the culmination of the apocalyptic tradition in a secular way. But despite the fact that it's a sort of linear narrative, what we get is we get constant reminders that the different figures in the history of apocalypticism repeat other figures, and different ideas repeat other ideas. So, for example, even though Hegel and Kierkegaard come after St. Paul, quite a long way, Taubes is saying that they take up the same themes and instantiate them again. So what we get, actually, he says a similar thing about Walter Benjamin and Paul as well. But what we get then is we get the sense that, history is obviously developing in some sort of a way. There's a difference between Hegel, Kierkegaard, and St. Paul. But nonetheless, there's a certain repetition of meaning. And similarly to Joachim of Fiore, towards the end of the book, Taubes predicts the new stage in the era of apocalypticism, which is completely cryptic, makes no sense, but he does try to do it. So the point here is, again, that by looking at these parallels between the current material and the past material, we are able to anticipate something into the future. So again, we have the same sort of spiral point of view, and a spiral point of view that puts into question this idea that eschatology is committed to this linear temporality with one end. Now, how does it relate to the first problem? So remember, our first problem was the exclusive focus on the environmental disaster as the future end of linear history blinds us to ends of history experienced by colonized communities in the past. So what I'm trying to say is the spiral shape of history enables us to account for past ends of the world and its concordance with ends to come. Present and future climate disasters should be understood as related to and oriented by ecological catastrophes of the past. And on top of that, the parallels between the world's end can help us to identify historical developments and thus to anticipate a qualitatively distinct era or status demanded by our existential situation, similarly to what Joachim and Taubes are doing. So, for example, past extinction events can be seen as offering insights into the character and the conditions of possible future extinction events, but they also point towards changes necessary for a habitable Earth for communities most affected by the destruction of their ecosystems, right? And I think this is an uncontroversial claim, by the way, that I'm making here. Sound like an analytic philosopher now, but it's an uncontroversial claim that kind of makes sense. But I also think that this kind of makes sense, namely that to understand the future, we have to look at the present and the past. It's weirdly sort of ignored when people start conceptualizing history and environmental history as well. So that's why I think the sort of spiral thing we can get from apocalyptic tradition is actually helpful. And so we shouldn't get rid of eschatology altogether. Very briefly, in terms of addressing this, the second problem, namely the problem of a single apocalyptic timeline, which creates this false sense of universalism, what we get when we look at the apocalyptic tradition are actually very different ways of thinking about time that are qualitatively distinct as well. So we have a time, there is a time of individuals. So this kind of refers to prophets having a sense that the end is near. So that's the kind of existential time. We have historiographical time. So we look at history. That's what Joachim and Taubes are doing, and we're seeing how that timeline unravels. But we can also have a cosmological time where we kind of look at sort of from extraterrestrial perspective. You know, that's going to be the kind of sci-fi situation, but also God kind of destroying the universe, or the sun being kind of imploding, and then what happens then. But the point is that actually, when you look at the apocalypticism, it's far, far, far away from thinking about history as just one timeline. It's different multiple timelines that come together, but they're not identical. And so we cannot really have this one timeline perspective. That's a mischaracterization of what's going on there. And this can address this problem that I identified, because if we actually start thinking about our situation as structured, our apocalyptic situation as structured by multiple timelines, we will be able to then think about the differentiation of the climate crises, both in terms of the past and the future and the present, but also in terms of sort of spatial differentiation on how certain communities are affected more than others. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I'll stop now maybe?
Sure.
Yeah, all right, thank you so much. Okay.